Have you ever noticed how life becomes heavy when you insist on carrying the weight of everything? Not just the things that truly matter, but also those little irritations, those expectations that never come true, those plans that crumble, those words someone said that you mentally repeat as if they were a sentence. Life becomes light when you stop taking everything so seriously, and this is not an invitation to irresponsibility, but a gateway to something deeper, something that Alan Watts spent his entire life trying to show us. That excessive seriousness is a prison we build for ourselves, brick by brick, with our worries, our judgments, our absolute certainties about how things should be. When you look at a child playing, you realize that they are completely immersed in the moment, not worrying about whether they are playing the right way or if there will be another opportunity to play tomorrow. They simply play. And in that simplicity, there is a wisdom we have lost along the way. A wisdom that tells us that life does not need to be a constant battle against uncertainty, against the unknown, against everything that escapes our control. Alan Watts taught that existence is like music. You do not listen to it just to reach the end. You do not appreciate a symphony only for the last chord. You live it note by note, moment by moment, and when you understand this, you realize that life is not a journey toward some glorious destination where you can finally relax and say you made it. Life is what is happening now, while you wait for it to truly begin. We have been taught to believe that seriousness is synonymous with maturity, that if you are not constantly worried, planning, striving, then you are not living properly. But this belief is one of the greatest illusions we carry because it turns existence into an endless burden. Life becomes light when you stop taking everything so seriously, when you understand that you do not need to have all the answers, that you do not need to control every variable, that you do not need to torture yourself for every mistake made or every opportunity lost. Alan Watts said that humans are the only animals capable of worrying about things that do not exist, of creating catastrophic mental scenarios about a future that never arrives, or of endlessly ruminating on a past that can no longer be changed. And in this dance between what was and what could be, we completely lose sight of what is, the only moment in which we are truly alive. You can spend your entire life preparing to live, accumulating experiences, titles, possessions, achievements, believing that when you finally have everything in place, when you finally feel secure, then you can relax and enjoy. But that moment never arrives, because the mind trained in seriousness will always find something new to worry about. There will always be one more step, one more goal, one more proof that you are still not ready. There is a profound lightness in accepting that life is not a problem to be solved, but a mystery to be lived. And this acceptance is not passivity. It is not giving up. It is precisely the opposite. It is the courage to be present even when everything seems uncertain, even when you have no guarantees, even when the future is an impenetrable fog. Life becomes light when you stop taking everything so seriously because you understand that most human suffering does not come from external circumstances, but from the resistance we offer to them, from the insistence that things should be different from how they are. Alan Watts used to say that we suffer only because we take seriously what the gods created for fun. And this statement carries a disturbing truth, that we turn existence into a battlefield where we fight against the nature of things, against impermanence, against uncertainty, against the very essence of life. When you observe nature, you realize that nothing in it is trying to be something else. The tree does not strive to be a tree. The river does not plan to be a river. Everything simply is, and in this being, there is a harmony, a flow, a dance that does not require effort because it is in tune with what is. But we, with our extraordinarily complicated human minds, create layer upon layer of worry, expectation, judgment, and then we wonder why life seems so difficult, so exhausting, so heavy. Life becomes light when you stop taking everything so seriously because you finally understand that you do not need to prove anything. You do not need to justify your existence through endless achievements. You do not need to carry the burden of being perfect or always being in control. Alan Watts reminds us that the idea of a separate, isolated self fighting against the rest of the universe is an illusion, that in reality, there is no division between you and the world, between the observer and the observed. Everything is a continuous movement, a dance where you are not only the dancer, but also the dance itself. When you realize this, not intellectually, but as a lived experience, something changes profoundly. You stop fighting against the current and begin to flow with it. You stop trying to force life to fit into your plans and start to notice that life already has its own rhythm, its own wisdom, and that you can trust it. How many times have you found yourself anxious about something that never happened? How many times have you lost sleep over worries that turned out to be unfounded? How many times have you missed enjoying a present moment because your mind was busy with 1,000 other things? Life becomes light when you stop taking everything so seriously, when you allow yourself to be here and now, without the need for everything to make sense immediately, without the pressure of having everything resolved, without the anxiety of a future you cannot control. Alan Watts taught that true wisdom is not in accumulating knowledge or mastering mental control techniques, but in realizing the illusory nature of the self that worries, the self that suffers, the self that judges and resists. This self that you think you are is not a fixed and permanent entity. It is merely a pattern of thoughts, memories, and sensations in constant change. And when you try to grasp it, define it, protect it, you create unnecessary suffering. If you stop now and observe your mind, you will see that it is constantly commenting, judging, comparing, planning, remembering. It is never simply here. It is always somewhere else. And this is the great trick that keeps us trapped in seriousness, in worry, in the constant weight of trying to be someone you imagine you should be. Life becomes light when you stop taking everything so seriously, because you finally tire of this internal struggle, this incessant attempt to improve, fix, control, and simply allow things to be as they are, not because you have given up, but because you have finally understood that life is not asking for your approval. It is simply happening, and you can choose to flow with it or fight against it. Alan Watts had a unique way of making us realize the absurdity of our excessive seriousness. He said that we live as if we are in a race where the prize is in the future. But when we get there, we discover that the prize was being present during the race. And we completely missed that because we were too busy running. So, if you are reading this now, if these words have found you at this moment, perhaps it is because some part of you is tired of carrying so much weight. Perhaps you are ready to experience what happens when you simply relax a little, when you stop demanding so much from yourself, when you allow life to be light, not because everything is perfect, but because you have finally realized that perfection was never the point. Life becomes light when you stop taking everything so seriously, and this lightness is not superficiality. It is the depth of someone who has finally understood that being alive is enough, that breathing is enough, that this moment, exactly as it is enough. If this content resonated with you, if something here touched a place that needed to be touched, subscribe to the channel to continue this journey of discovery. Leave your like so that more people can find this message, and comment your city. I want to know where you are watching us from, and which part of this script made the most sense to you. Most of our anguish comes from a very simple source: the belief that there is a right way to live, and that we, somehow, are not living up to that expectation. We spend our days comparing ourselves to imaginary versions of ourselves, to people who seem to have everything figured out, to impossible standards that society imposes on us. And in this constant comparison, we completely lose the opportunity to simply be. Life becomes light when you stop taking everything so seriously because you finally allow yourself to fail, allow yourself to be imperfect, allow yourself not to know, and discover that in this acceptance there is immense freedom, a freedom you would never find in the pursuit of perfection. Alan Watts reminds us that nature knows no failure. A tree that does not grow as tall as the others is not failing. It is simply being what it is with the conditions it has, and there is beauty in this simplicity, a wisdom that transcends all our mental complications. Have you noticed how we expend energy trying to control things that are completely beyond our reach? We worry about what others think, about unpredictable future events, about hypothetical scenarios that will probably never materialize. And in this attempt to control the uncontrollable, we lose our peace, our lightness, our ability to simply be here. Life becomes light when you stop taking everything so seriously, when you recognize the limits of your control and, instead of fighting against them, learn to dance within them. Alan Watts used to use the metaphor of water to illustrate this. You cannot hold water by squeezing harder. The more you squeeze, the more it slips through your fingers. But if you keep your hands open, it stays there, flowing naturally. Life works the same way. The more you try to force it, the more resistance you encounter. But when you relax into the experience, when you allow things to flow naturally, you discover an ease that was always available, but that you could not perceive while you were too tense to notice. There is a deeply rooted belief in our culture that if you are not constantly striving, if you are not suffering a little, then you are not really making progress. This idea is everywhere, in work, in relationships, in personal development, and it keeps us trapped in a cycle of perpetual tension. Life becomes light when you stop taking everything so seriously because you question this belief and discover that true growth, true transformation, happens not through forced effort, but through understanding, insight, and clear perception of what is. Alan Watts taught that real change does not come from you trying to be different from what you are, but from you seeing clearly what you are, because in that clear vision, transformation happens naturally, effortlessly, like a flower blooming when the conditions are right. You cannot force a flower to bloom by pulling its petals. You simply create the conditions and allow nature to do its work. And the same applies to your own life, your own consciousness, your own awakening. Think of how many times you have punished yourself for not being good enough, for not meeting some arbitrary standard, for being too human, with all the contradictions, fears, and imperfections that this implies. Life becomes light when you stop taking everything so seriously, when you finally give yourself permission to be exactly who you are, without excuses, without justifications, without the constant need to improve before accepting yourself. Alan Watts had a provocative way of expressing this. He said that trying to improve yourself is like trying to bite your own teeth. The more you try, the more you realize the fundamental impossibility of the endeavor, because who is this you, trying to improve the you? This internal division is the root of so much suffering, this idea that there is a higher self that needs to control and discipline a lower self, when in fact there are not two selves. There is only experience happening moment to moment without division. When you truly understand this, not just intellectually but as a lived perception, something extraordinary happens. You stop fighting with yourself. You stop constantly judging yourself. You stop carrying that sense of inadequacy that has colored your entire experience. Life becomes light when you stop taking everything so seriously because you finally let go of this internal war and discover that, without it, there is a natural lightness, a spontaneity, a capacity to respond to life in a fresh and direct way without the heavy filters of judgment and self-condemnation. Alan Watts often pointed out the paradox that the more you seek happiness, the more it seems to escape, because the very search implies that you do not have it now, that it is somewhere in the future, and thus you create a distance between yourself and what you seek. But happiness, peace, lightness are not things you acquire through effort. They are what emerges naturally when you stop interfering, when you stop complicating, when you simply allow life to be what it is. Observe your breath now for a moment. You do not need to make it happen. It simply happens. When you sleep, when you are distracted, when you are not even thinking about it, breathing continues because it does not depend on your conscious effort. It is a natural movement of life through you. Life becomes light when you stop taking everything so seriously, when you realize that just as breathing happens without you needing to manage it, much of life can also flow naturally if you stop interfering so much, if you trust a little more in the process. Alan Watts used the example of how you know how to walk. You do not consciously think about every muscle you need to contract, every balance adjustment. You simply walk. And the more you try to consciously control every aspect of walking, the more clumsy you become. The same principle applies to all of life. There is a natural intelligence, an organic wisdom that knows what to do when you get out of the way, when you stop trying to micromanage every aspect of existence. This does not mean you become passive or irresponsible. On the contrary, when you stop wasting energy on useless worries and counterproductive efforts, you have much more clarity and capacity to respond appropriately to situations that truly require your attention. Life becomes light when you stop taking everything so seriously because you learn to discern between what really matters and what is just mental noise, between genuine action and anxious agitation, between creative response and automatic reaction based on fear. Alan Watts spoke about the difference between living spontaneously and living in a calculated manner. When you are constantly calculating, weighing each decision against possible future consequences, you lose the ability to respond in a fresh and appropriate way to what is happening now. True spontaneity is not irresponsible impulsiveness. It is the ability to act from a place of total presence, where your response emerges naturally from the situation, without being filtered through layers and layers of fear and conditioning. Have you ever had the experience of being so absorbed in something that you completely lost track of time, forgot yourself, forgot all your worries? In those moments, you were living lightly, not because everything was perfect, but because you were not taking yourself so seriously, not constantly monitoring and judging your own experience. Life becomes light when you stop taking everything so seriously, when you allow those moments of total absorption, of complete presence, to become more common, not as something you force, but as something you allow by relaxing your constant need for control. Alan Watts invites us to recognize that life itself could be lived this way, not as a series of tasks to be completed to finally arrive somewhere, but as a dance where each step is complete in itself, where the value is in the movement, not in the destination. There is something profoundly liberating in recognizing that you do not need to have all the answers, that you do not need to know exactly where you are going, that it is okay not to have your life completely planned and mapped out. Life becomes light when you stop taking everything so seriously because you embrace uncertainty instead of fighting against it. You recognize that uncertainty is the very texture of life, and that trying to eliminate it is trying to eliminate the very possibility of novelty, surprise, and genuine growth. Alan Watts wrote an entire book about this called The Wisdom of Insecurity, where he argues that our obsessive quest for security is precisely what makes us insecure, because we are always on the defensive, always trying to build walls against an unpredictable future, and in those walls, we imprison ourselves. True security, he suggested, comes not from trying to control the future, but from developing the ability to respond creatively to whatever arises, to trust in your own resilience and adaptability. When you observe nature, you see that everything is in constant change. The seasons change, the tides rise, and they descend, the trees grow and die. Everything flows in natural cycles of birth, growth, decline, and renewal. And there is no resistance in this. There is only participation in the great movement of life. Life becomes light when you stop taking everything so seriously, when you recognize that you are also part of these cycles, that there will be moments of expansion and moments of contraction, moments of clarity and moments of confusion, and that all of them are equally valid, equally part of the process. Alan Watts reminds us that trying to keep everything always positive, always growing, always improving, is like trying to have a day without night or a wave without a trough. It is fundamentally against the nature of how things work. When you accept the cycles, when you allow for moments of stillness and moments of activity, moments of joy and moments of sadness, you stop fighting against life and start flowing with it. There is a tendency in our culture to pathologize any uncomfortable experience, to immediately try to fix, medicate, or eliminate anything that is not pleasurable. But this attitude separates us even more from the totality of the human experience. Life becomes light when you stop taking everything so seriously, when you develop the ability to be with discomfort without needing to eliminate it immediately, when you recognize that sadness, frustration, uncertainty are all natural parts of the human experience and not signs that something is fundamentally wrong with you. Alan Watts spoke about how we create a second layer of suffering by resisting the first. You feel sadness and then feel sad about being sad. You feel anxiety and then become anxious about your anxiety, and thus a spiral of self-generated suffering is created. But when you simply allow the emotion to be what it is, when you stop adding all the mental narrative about what it means and what you should do about it, you discover that emotions are like waves. They rise, reach a peak, and naturally dissipate. How many hours have you wasted ruminating over past conversations, imagining what you should have said, what the other person was really thinking, building elaborate theories about intentions and meanings? Life becomes light when you stop taking everything so seriously, when you recognize that most of this mental drama is completely unnecessary, that you are creating problems where none exist, complicating what could be simple. Alan Watts had a fun way of pointing this out. He said that humans are unique in their ability to worry about worries, to create layers and layers of anxiety about things that haven't even happened and probably never will. When you see this clearly, when you catch your mind in the act of creating these elaborate mental sandcastles, you can simply laugh and let go, not because you are avoiding something important, but because you have finally recognized the game your mind was playing. The lightness that Alan Watts points to is not superficiality or indifference. It is a depth that comes from seeing through the illusions we create. It is the freedom that arises when you stop completely identifying with your thoughts and emotions and recognize that you are the awareness that witnesses them. Life becomes light when you stop taking everything so seriously, when you discover that space of witness, that quiet place that can observe the drama of the mind without being completely swept away by it. This does not happen through more effort, more techniques, more attempts to control. It happens through a simple relaxation of attention, a allowing things to be as they are without constant interference. It's like when you are trying to remember a name, and the more you force it, the more it escapes. But the moment you relax and stop trying, it simply appears. You have spent so much time building an idea of who you should be, of how your life should look, of what kind of person you need to become, that you have lost touch with the simplicity of just being. Life becomes light when you stop taking everything so seriously, when you let go of those elaborate mental constructions and allow yourself to simply exist without excuses, without justifications, without the constant need to prove your worth. Alan Watts often pointed out that we are so busy trying to live up to some imaginary ideal that we completely forget to live the real life that is happening here and now. The paradox is that the more you try to be special, important, significant, the more you separate yourself from the direct experience of life, the more you become an abstraction to yourself. But when you relax that need, when you allow yourself to be ordinary, common, human, you discover an extraordinary richness in the very ordinariness of experience. Look around you now. Observe the objects, the colors, the sounds. Without naming, without judging, without doing anything about it, just notice the direct experience of being alive in this moment. Life becomes light when you stop taking everything so seriously, when you repeatedly return to that direct, simple, immediate experience before all interpretations, all stories, all judgments. Alan Watts invites us to recognize that this moment, just as it is complete, needs nothing added or subtracted, does not need your approval or disapproval. It simply is. And to the extent that you can meet it without all the mental baggage, you discover a lightness, a grace, an ease that has always been available, but that you were too busy to notice. So, in the end, life becomes light when you stop taking everything so seriously, not because you learned some special technique or reached some elevated state, but simply because you got tired of carrying so much unnecessary weight and decided to let it go. You realize that you can trust life, not because it will always give you what you want, but because in any case you have the ability to respond, to adapt, to find meaning even in the most difficult circumstances. Alan Watts spent his life pointing to this simple yet profound truth, that you are already complete, that life is already complete, that in this very moment, before any improvement or change, there is a fundamental perfection in existence itself. And when you see this, really see it not as a beautiful idea, but as the lived reality of your experience, then you can finally relax into that lightness that has always been your true nature. You can dance through life without the overwhelming weight of excessive seriousness, and discover that what you have always been looking for was here all along, hidden in plain sight, patiently waiting for you to stop searching and simply notice. If this journey resonated with you, if you feel ready to explore more deeply this way of living, subscribe to the channel, leave your like so that this message reaches more people who need to hear it, and comment your city. I love to know where you are following us from and how these ideas are transforming your lives.